The stage was too big for him, the microphone too tall, and the silence almost cruel. A 5-year-old boy stood there, his small hands clutching the hem of his shirt, his shoes barely reaching the edge of the wooden floor. The light hit his face, and too bright, too exposing, and for a moment he froze. 1,000 eyes watched, waiting, unsure whether to cheer or to laugh. The crowd didn't know his name. The judges didn't expect anything. And the boy? He didn't even know if his voice would come out. Behind him, his brothers adjusted their instruments, nervous, whispering, trying not to let their own fear show. They had practiced for weeks in their cramped little living room, where the wallpaper peeled and the windows rattled every time a truck rolled by. But this was different. This was a stage. This was judgment. The judges leaned forward, unimpressed. One crossed his arms. Another scribbled something on paper. The air was heavy with skepticism. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He's too small." Someone else murmured, "This should be interesting." And in that instant, before the music, before the fame, before history, the boy took one trembling breath. He couldn't even reach the microphone properly. His head barely aligned with the silver grill, so he rose on his toes, stretching every inch of his little frame. His brothers looked at him silently praying, and then something happened. Something that would rewrite everything. The boy closed his eyes. The spotlight felt like a heartbeat, and when he opened his mouth, the sound that came out didn't belong to a child. It was raw, powerful, full of emotion no 5-year-old should understand. It silenced the laughter. It stopped the whispers. It froze the judges mid-note. The voice that filled that hall carried the pain of generations, the rhythm of survival and the innocence of something divine. The judges leaned back, their expressions shifting from indifference to disbelief. The crowd that had doubted began to rise, and in that moment, the boy who could barely reach the mic reached every soul in the room. The music ended. The hall was silent for half a second, that electric silence before a storm. Then thunder, applause so loud it drowned out thought, and the boy just stood there, wide-eyed, not understanding what he had just done, only feeling that something in the world had changed, because it had. That was the night a child named Michael stopped being ordinary. That was the night the world saw a glimpse of destiny. But to understand what truly happened that night, how a 5-year-old could hold an entire hall in the palm of his hand, you have to go back. Back to where the music began, back to the streets of Gary, Indiana, back to the small house where greatness was born, and innocence was lost. Gary, Indiana, a city built on steel and sweat. In the 1960s, its sky was gray, its streets rough, and its rhythm steady, a rhythm born from struggle and survival. In one tiny house on Jackson Street, that rhythm lived in every heartbeat. A small, crowded home filled with noise, laughter, and sometimes shouting. 9 children, 2 parents, and one dream too big for its walls. Joseph Jackson, a man shaped by hardship, worked long hours in the steel mills, his hands calloused, his patience short. But every night when he came home, he listened to the sounds of his sons tapping rhythms on the table, humming to the radio, turning chaos into harmony. He saw something rare, and he decided it would not go to waste. Discipline became religion. Rehearsal became survival. Every missed note earned a glare. Every mistake, a lesson. The Jackson brothers, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and the youngest, Michael, practiced until their fingers hurt and their feet ached. In that small living room, the seeds of perfection were planted. But even in those early days, something about Michael was different. He was smaller, quieter, but when he sang, everything stopped. His brother's eyes would flick toward him, almost in disbelief. His voice, clear, aching, alive, carried a force far beyond his years. Sometimes Joseph would pause in the doorway, listening. He'd say nothing, just nod, because he knew that little boy was going to change everything. The family performed at local events, weddings, community centers, school shows, anywhere that would have them. They didn't have fancy instruments or stage lights. What they had was drive, hunger, and a rhythm that couldn't be taught. The people of Gary started talking. Those Jackson boys can play. But that little one can sing. Word spread until one day an opportunity came. A local talent contest. It wasn't much. Just a small hall, a few folding chairs, and 3 judges from the community. But for the Jacksons, it was everything. A chance, a stage, a moment to be seen. The night before the show, Michael couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of his father's words. Don't mess up. He wasn't scared of singing. He was scared of failing, and yet, even in that fear, something inside him and something pure and electric whispered, "This is your time." The next morning, the brothers dressed in matching outfits their mother had stitched herself. Polished shoes, tucked shirts, nervous smiles. As they walked toward the small community center, they didn't know it yet. But that night, a legend was about to be born. The hall was small, but to Michael, it felt like a world. The air smelled faintly of dust and wood polish, and the stage lights glared down like eyes waiting to judge. Dozens of people filled the folding chairs. Neighbors, friends, teachers, families. The murmur of conversation mixed with laughter and the occasional shout of encouragement. Backstage, the Jackson brothers fidgeted. Jermaine tuned his guitar. Tito adjusted his jacket. Marlon kept pacing. But all eyes, sooner or later, drifted to Michael. He stood off to the side, silent. The youngest of them all, 5 years old. His voice barely audible, his expression unreadable. "Michael, you ready?" Jermaine whispered. Michael nodded, but his small hands trembled. In the audience, the judges sat at a long wooden table. 3 men in suits, stone-faced, pens in hand. To them, this was just another act. Another group of local kids trying their luck. The MC's voice echoed through the speakers. "Next up, the Jackson brothers." Applause rippled, polite but unexcited. The brothers stepped out, lined up, and faced the crowd. The microphone stood at the center, tall, gleaming, like a tower. Michael walked toward it and stopped. He looked up. The mic was above his eye level. He couldn't reach it. The audience chuckled softly. One judge smiled, amused. For a second, Michael felt the burn of shame rise in his chest. Then, quietly, he straightened. Without a word, he rose on his toes, stretching his small frame upward. His chin lifted, his hands clenched at his sides, and in that instant, the laughter faded. There was something defiant in his stance, something unspoken, but powerful. His brothers started playing. The first notes of rhythm echoed through the hall, raw, imperfect, alive, and Michael just stood there breathing. The judges leaned forward. The audience went still. It was as if the air itself was waiting. Then, the boy sang. The first note cut through the silence like lightning. It wasn't just beautiful, it was impossible. A voice so full, so soulful, so utterly fearless that even the skeptics forgot to breathe. The laughter was gone. The whispers died. Every face turned toward the sound coming from a child who wasn't supposed to sound like that. The judge's pens froze mid-air. One lowered his glasses. Another's eyes widened. This wasn't just talent. This was something sacred. Michael moved instinctively, swaying with rhythm he didn't learn. He felt it. His voice soared, dipped, and cracked open emotions no 5-year-old should understand, but somehow did. The audience sat spellbound. Time slowed, and as the song reached its final note, he held it, pure, unwavering, until the very air trembled. When silence returned, it wasn't empty. It was heavy and full of awe. Then, one by one, people stood. The judges first, then the crowd, then the entire hall, clapping, cheering, a roar of belief, disbelief, and wonder. The boy who could barely reach the microphone had just reached greatness. He didn't smile. He didn't understand the full weight of what he'd done. He only knew that something had shifted, in the air, in his heart, in the world itself. That night, Gary, Indiana witnessed more than a performance. It witnessed the beginning of a phenomenon, the birth of Michael Jackson, the child who would grow to move the earth itself. And yet, even in that triumph, a shadow lingered. Because with every note that lifted him higher, silence has a sound that presses against your chest, that fills the air with questions. That's what hung over the stage as the lights dimmed slightly, as the Jackson brothers stood frozen in their spots. The audience didn't know what to expect. A 5-year-old standing before them like a shadow in the glow of the spotlight, too small for the microphone, too young for the moment. Every heartbeat in that hall seemed to echo louder than the instruments waiting to play. Michael looked out, but all he could see were outlines, rows of faces, shapes blurred by brightness. His brothers were behind him, silent, waiting for the cue that would start the song. He could feel their nerves like electricity in the air, but inside him, inside that tiny frame, something ancient stirred. It wasn't just excitement. It was something heavier, something like purpose. He remembered his father's voice earlier that morning, deep, commanding, absolute. Don't forget what I told you. When you sing, make them feel it. Don't just sing it, live it. Michael didn't fully understand those words. He just knew that when he opened his mouth to sing at home, something strange always happened. People stopped moving. The world paused. His brothers said it was like hearing something from another place. Now, standing in front of strangers, he wasn't sure if he could make that happen again. The microphone loomed above him like a tower. It caught the light, gleaming, reminding him how small he really was. For a fleeting moment, fear crept in. The kind of fear that makes your throat tighten and your eyes sting. What if his voice cracked? What if he forgot the words? What if his father looked at him afterward and saw failure instead of pride? He almost stepped back, almost. But then something flickered across his face. A quiet defiance. A whisper of belief, maybe even destiny. He remembered his mother's gentle words when he told her he was scared. Don't worry, baby. Just sing from your heart. That's where your strength is. He inhaled slowly. The lights above seemed to fade into stars. The hall melted away until there was nothing but that heartbeat, steady, rising. Then the cue came. A nod from Jermaine, the first soft strum of the guitar. Michael's eyes lifted. The music began, hesitant, uncertain, just like the boy himself. Every sound, every beat, every vibration seemed to pull at something deep inside him. He opened his mouth, and time stopped. It wasn't a song anymore. It was a story, one told through the voice of a child who carried emotions too vast for his age. Every syllable came with conviction, every note wrapped in truth. The audience froze, unsure if what they were hearing was real. The voice was angelic, but there was something else inside it. A grit, a sorrow, a fire. How could a 5-year-old know what heartbreak sounded like? How could a child understand the way a note bends when it carries pain? They didn't know, but they felt it. Every person in that room, from the judges at the front to the last man leaning against the back wall, felt something shift. Even the air seemed to vibrate differently now. The boy didn't move much, just a slight sway, but his eyes, wide, intense, told a story that words never could. His small hands clenched at his sides as if holding on to something invisible, something sacred. And in those seconds, Michael Jackson wasn't a child anymore. He was a vessel, for rhythm, for emotion, for a force that had been waiting to speak through him. Each note climbed higher, breaking through disbelief. Each pause stretched longer, drawing the audience closer, pulling their hearts toward his. The judge's pen stopped moving. The audience forgot to breathe. Then came that single moment, the final note. Long, perfect, defiant. When it ended, the silence returned. But this silence was different. This one was reverence. It was the silence that follows revelation. The breath held after something divine touches the world. For 1 second, no one clapped. No one moved. The only sound was Michael's soft breathing, the echo of his own heartbeat still ringing in his chest. Then, as if by instinct, One judge stood, then another, then the whole crowd. Applause erupted, fierce and overwhelming, but Michael just stood there, blinking, confused. He didn't understand what had just happened. He only knew that the fear was gone. Somewhere deep inside, something whispered, "This is where you belong." And as the cheers filled the hall, he realized something else. He hadn't just sung a song. He had changed the air in the room. A new sound had entered the world. And it bore his name. But as the applause roared on, one question hung like smoke. How could something so pure, so bright, ever stay untouched? It's one thing to sing. It's another to become the song. That's what happened next. Once the shock of that first note wore off, the crowd realized they were witnessing something more than a performance. It was possession. A tiny boy, too young to understand the weight of what he was channeling, was transformed before their eyes. The Jackson brothers exchanged glances. They had rehearsed hundreds of times, but this was new. Michael wasn't just following rhythm. He was the rhythm. His voice carried a strange duality, innocence and wisdom, joy and sorrow, the ache of something divine trapped in a child's frame. As he sang, his small frame moved with an instinct older than his years. It wasn't choreographed. It was natural, the body's honest response to emotion too large to contain. The audience was captivated. The judges leaned forward, mouths slightly open. They weren't watching a child sing. They were witnessing something beyond explanation. Some called it talent. Others might have called it spirit. But whatever it was, it demanded attention. Every verse deepened the spell. The first line had stunned them. The second made them believe. By the third, they were his. Every heart in that hall beating to the rhythm of a 5-year-old soul. There was no hesitation now. No fear. Michael had crossed an invisible threshold, and from performer to phenomenon, he didn't think about how to hit the next note. He didn't think about the crowd or the judges or even his father. The music carried him, and he simply followed. His voice bent with raw emotion, sorrow, hope, defiance, painting pictures words couldn't describe. At one point, a woman in the crowd covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. A man beside her whispered, "That voice. It's not from here." The judges exchanged a look. Silent agreement. They were witnessing something no contest could measure. As the song neared its end, Michael's voice began to rise, climbing, trembling, daring the impossible. Each word seemed to carry a lifetime's worth of feeling. Then came the final chorus. That moment when everything peaks, when sound becomes spirit. His brother's instruments faded slightly, leaving space. Space for him. For that voice that no longer belonged to a 5-year-old, but to history itself. He held the last note longer than he ever had before. Eyes closed, head lifted, as though offering it to something unseen. When the sound finally died, the silence that followed was unlike anything before. It wasn't the silence of disbelief this time. It was worship. And then, it broke. The hall exploded with applause. People rose to their feet. Chairs scraped the floor. It wasn't polite clapping anymore. It was surrender. The judges stood, clapping harder than anyone. One of them shook his head in disbelief, smiling wide. The crowd didn't just cheer. They shouted his name. "That boy! That Jackson boy!" The brothers looked at Michael, their eyes wide with something between pride and awe. They knew this wasn't just a win. This was the beginning of something far greater than any of them could comprehend. Michael didn't move. His chest rose and fell as he caught his breath, eyes still wide with the dazed confusion of a dreamer waking up. He looked out at the crowd, the blur of faces, the waves of sound, the storm of hands clapping and cheering, and for a moment, he smiled, a small, shy, almost hesitant smile. He didn't know it then, but that smile would one day be recognized by billions. He had come to sing one song, but what he'd done was start a movement, one that would stretch across decades, across continents, across generations. That night, in that small hall in Gary, Indiana, The judges rose to their feet. But in truth, the whole world had begun to rise. For years to come, people would try to describe that performance. They would call it gifted, extraordinary, miraculous. But none of those words would capture what it really was. It was the spark, the first ignition of a force that would change the landscape of music forever. The crowd didn't know his name yet, but soon everyone would. As the applause finally began to fade, Michael turned his head slightly. In the wings, his father watched, silent, expression unreadable. For just a second, their eyes met. Joseph didn't smile. He only nodded once, a small, deliberate gesture. Michael nodded back, and just like that, the moment ended. The boy walked off the stage, still clutching the edges of his jacket, still breathing fast, still unaware that he had just crossed from childhood into legend. The world didn't know it yet. But the king of pop had just taken his first throne. And with that, the story was no longer about what happened on that stage, but what that moment would cost him for the rest of his life. For a few seconds after that final note faded, the world held its breath. Then, it erupted. Applause crashed like thunder, sweeping through the hall with uncontrollable energy. People were shouting, whistling, clapping, stamping their feet. It was chaos, beautiful, joyous chaos. Some in the crowd laughed out of disbelief, others cried openly. Even the judges, who had entered the night as silent gatekeepers, now stood smiling, clapping, caught in the same storm of emotion as everyone else. And in the middle of it all stood Michael, still, silent. He looked around, blinking rapidly as if trying to understand what this sound meant. He had never heard an audience roar like that before, never felt the weight of so many hearts turned toward him. His brothers were smiling too, proud and relieved, each of them caught between amazement and something they couldn't quite name. They knew they had played well, but it was Michael who had moved the room. For the crowd, the performance was over. But for the boy, something had just begun. The applause didn't die down. It built higher, as though the audience needed to release the emotion that performance had pulled from them. Every person in that room felt they had seen something they'd never forget. A man in the back shouted, "Encore!" A woman near the front called out, "That boy's got soul!" And indeed he did. More soul than anyone could understand. Michael's brothers turned toward him, encouraging him to take a bow. But he didn't move at first. He just stood there, stunned, his chest rising and falling, his small face lost somewhere between pride and wonder. Then shyly, he smiled. It wasn't the confident smile of a performer who knew he'd nailed it. It was the smile of a little boy realizing that people loved him. Not just his song, but him. That moment became something sacred. A moment that every person there would remember. A moment they'd tell their children about. "I was there," they'd say. "I saw the Jackson kid when he was just 5 years old." When the applause finally started to fade, a hush returned. The MC took the stage, trying to steady his own voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, looking down at the brothers, "I think we've just seen the future." The words hung in the air. The future. Michael looked up at his brothers, Jermaine, Tito, Marlon, Jackie, and saw tears in their eyes. But behind the pride, he also saw something else, something complicated. It was admiration, yes, but also realization. Their youngest brother had just become the center of gravity. The judges leaned toward one another, whispering. One of them shook his head and said quietly, "He's too young for that voice." Another replied, "No, he's exactly the right age. That's what makes it real." When the announcement came, the winners of the contest, it was no surprise. "The Jackson brothers!" Cheers filled the air again. But this time it was more than celebration. It was recognition. As they took their small trophy and exited the stage, people reached out to shake their hands, pat their shoulders, shout their congratulations. And everywhere they went, eyes followed the smallest one, the little boy who sang like a man. Backstage, Michael sat quietly on a folding chair, holding the trophy in his lap. His brothers laughed and talked, reliving the moment, mimicking the stunned looks of the judges. But Michael didn't say much. He just stared at the golden surface, watching it catch the light. He wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about the feeling, the way his heart had pounded, the way the crowd's roar had washed over him. It wasn't just applause. It was energy. It was connection. And something in him, something fragile, something sacred, decided he wanted to feel that again. That need would grow. That moment would define him, and that sound, that roar of love, would become both his driving force and his haunting echo for the rest of his life. The night was over, but the legend had begun. Yet as the brothers walked toward their father, the sound of celebration fading behind them, another sound took its place, the heavy footsteps of ambition. Joseph Jackson stood waiting. His eyes were calm but sharp, calculating. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He just looked at his son and said softly, "Now we know what you can do." A statement that sounded like pride, but felt like a command. Michael looked up, unsure whether to smile or shrink. But the meaning was clear. From now on, there was no turning back. That night, the world discovered Michael Jackson. But Michael was about to lose the world he knew. The next morning, the world looked the same. Gray skies, factory smoke, the hum of Gary, Indiana. But for the Jackson family, everything had changed. Their phone rang non-stop. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate them. People on the street called out, "That's the Jackson kid!" For the first time, the family felt like their name meant something. And for Joseph Jackson, that meant opportunity. He didn't waste a moment. The very next day, he gathered the boys in the living room, lined them up, and said, "If you want to be great, you practice like greats. No celebration, no rest, just work." The brothers picked up their instruments. Michael stood at the front, ready but weary. The echo of last night's cheers still rang in his mind, but so did his father's voice. Every note mattered now. Every step had to be sharper, cleaner, stronger. Joseph's vision was fierce and unrelenting. He saw not 5 boys, but 5 keys to something greater. He saw a way out of poverty, a way out of the factory, a way into history, and for that, he demanded perfection. Michael tried to keep up. His small frame couldn't always handle the hours of dancing and singing, but he didn't complain. He couldn't, because every time he felt tired, he remembered that sound, that ocean of applause, and it kept him moving. But with every rehearsal, with every push toward greatness, something in him quietly shifted. The boy who sang from the heart began to sing from fear. One missed note could mean a glare. One stumble could earn a scolding. It was love wrapped in pressure, approval that had to be earned again and again, and yet even under that pressure, the magic didn't die. It deepened. Michael learned to channel pain into power, discipline into rhythm. When his father shouted, he sang harder. When exhaustion came, he danced through it. When tears welled up, he turned them into melody. And so perfection was born, not from joy, but from survival. As the brothers began performing around the city, more and more people noticed. Word spread beyond Gary. Talent scouts began whispering about the little Jackson boy. At one show, a local promoter told Joseph, "That kid's gonna be famous." Joseph smiled for the first time in weeks. "No," he said. "They all will be." But even he knew the truth. The spotlight belonged to one. Backstage, the brothers felt it too. They loved Michael, but his voice outshined everything. What had once been a group effort was slowly turning into a single story. Sometimes, after a show, Tito or Jermaine would sit quietly while fans crowded around Michael, asking for his autograph, his picture, his smile. They were proud, but pride comes with shadows. And Michael, too young to understand fame, just wanted to go home and play like other kids. But there was no other anymore. Music was no longer a game. It was destiny. The Jackson family's reputation grew until a new invitation arrived. A real audition for a Motown representative in Chicago. It was the kind of opportunity people prayed for. And yet, when Joseph told the family, Michael didn't jump for joy. He just nodded, quietly, obediently. He was beginning to learn the rule of greatness. You don't celebrate the climb. You climb harder. That night, he sat by the window staring at the streetlights. He thought about the hall, the applause, the people rising to their feet. It felt like a lifetime ago, he whispered to himself. I just wanted to sing, but the truth was, his voice had done something no child's voice should do. It had become a key to escape, a promise of a better life for everyone. And promises like that come with a price. The little boy who could barely reach the mic was now being pushed toward the biggest stage in the world. And though he didn't know it yet, each step would take him farther from that small community hall and from the boy he used to be. Because once the world starts clapping for you, it never stops demanding that you keep performing. The applause that once lifted him was about to become the sound that haunted him. By the time the Jackson brothers reached Chicago, the legend had already begun to take shape. People whispered stories about the tiny boy who could sing like a man, who had the rhythm of a lifetime locked inside his small frame. But Michael didn't understand words like legend. He just knew that more eyes were watching now. The Chicago audition wasn't like the local contests. It wasn't friendly or familiar. It was business. The room smelled of polished wood and cigarette smoke, and the men behind the table didn't smile. They didn't clap. They just stared, studying, calculating. For Joseph Jackson, this was war. For his sons, it was survival. And for Michael, it was destiny waiting to be tested. When he stepped up to the mic, he could barely see over the stand again. It was déjà vu, another room, another set of judges, another moment where everything depended on whether his small voice could move grown men. But this time, there was no nervous tremble, no hesitation. Michael had learned something powerful, to turn fear into fire. The first note silenced the room. By the second, one of the men lowered his pen. By the third, everyone forgot this was a child standing before them. It wasn't just his tone or pitch or control, it was his soul. Every phrase carried the ache of someone far older than 5. Every word sounded like it had lived through pain and joy, and somehow found beauty in both. When he finished, the silence was heavy. That sacred silence that means something extraordinary just happened. One of the Motown representatives leaned forward and said softly, "Who taught him to sing like that?" Joseph answered quickly, "God did." There were no more questions. Just quiet nods. Within weeks, the Jackson 5 were being invited to perform at bigger venues. School gyms turned into stages, then city halls, then theaters. Everywhere they went, the same thing happened. People would sit politely, expecting a children's act, and leave believing they had witnessed the birth of greatness. And at the center of it all, the same 5-year-old, now growing but still impossibly small, would bow shyly after each performance, unaware he was becoming a symbol of something larger than life. Newspapers began to mention his name. Radio hosts spoke about that Jackson kid. Even industry professionals, hardened by years of chasing talent, began to whisper, "This one, he's different." But behind every headline, there was sacrifice. The boys no longer played in the yard. They rehearsed. They no longer spent lazy Sundays as a family. They toured. And every smile on stage was followed by exhaustion behind the curtain. Yet Michael never complained. He couldn't. He was too busy, chasing that same electric feeling, that pure moment of connection he'd first felt when the crowd rose to its feet in Gary. He began to understand the secret language of music, how to read emotion, how to bend a lyric until it hurt, how to make strangers feel what he felt inside. Every show was a test, every applause a promise that he was still enough. Because even at that young age, deep inside, a thought had taken root. If I stop singing, will they stop loving me? That thought would follow him for the rest of his life. But for now, the dream was rising. Motown would soon call again, this time with a contract that would open doors, but also close others forever. It was the beginning of stardom, and the quiet end of childhood. As the train pulled away from Gary toward Detroit, Michael looked out the window at his hometown fading in the distance. The cracked sidewalks, the familiar factory smoke, the little streets where he used to play. He didn't wave, he just stared, silent, because something in him already knew. Once you leave home chasing the world's applause, it's almost impossible to go back. Detroit, Motown, a city where dreams were made and broken in the same breath. The Jackson 5 arrived wide-eyed, surrounded by sounds and legends. The air was alive with music. Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, the gods of their era. But amidst that brilliance, one small boy stole the light. Motown executives couldn't look away from Michael. His eyes carried innocence, but his voice carried truth. He sang as if he'd lived 1,000 lives, and in a way, he had. The studio lights, the cameras, the endless takes, they were all new to him, but he adapted faster than anyone imagined. He didn't just sing the notes, he became them. When producers told him to sing it with more pain, he didn't ask what they meant. He already knew, because pain was something he'd learned early. The pressure to be perfect, the fear of disappointing his father, the longing to simply be seen beyond the stage lights. But pain can be alchemy. Michael turned it into gold. The recording sessions stretched for hours, sometimes days. The other boys would tire, but Michael's focus never wavered. He was hungry, not for fame, but for connection. Every time he sang, he felt closer to something divine, something pure. The same force that had moved him that first night when the audience rose to their feet. The first record dropped. The world stopped. Songs like I Want You Back and ABC rocketed through radios everywhere. Suddenly, that little boy from Gary wasn't just a performer, he was a phenomenon. Posters, magazine covers. Screaming fans! The world had fallen in love, but inside the whirlwind, Michael began to fade from himself. The demands were endless. Interviews, rehearsals, flights, performances. The boy was now a product, a machine of magic that could never stop. He missed birthdays, missed sleep, missed being a child. The other brothers noticed the change. They saw how tired he was, how quiet he became after the shows. But no one dared speak. Success was too heavy, too sacred to question. And Joseph, ever the strategist, pushed harder. You have to keep working, he'd say. This is what greatness costs. Michael nodded. But in his heart, he wondered, why does greatness feel so lonely? He'd stand on stages, surrounded by thousands of screaming fans, yet feel completely unseen, because the applause wasn't for Michael the boy. It was for the myth they'd already built. The world was falling in love with a reflection, and the real child inside was slipping further into shadow. Fame, he began to understand, was a mirror that gave you everything you wanted, except yourself. And yet, he couldn't walk away, because somewhere deep inside, that same 5-year-old was still chasing that first moment. The warmth of love that came when he opened his heart, and the world answered. But now the world demanded it again and again, louder each time. And no matter how much he gave, it never felt like enough. The boy who could barely reach the mic had reached the world. And yet, somehow he was still reaching for something he couldn't name. Maybe for peace. Maybe for childhood. Maybe for the silence between songs where no one expected him to be perfect. Late at night, when the lights dimmed and the crowds disappeared, he'd sit by the window of his hotel room, humming softly. Not the songs that made him famous, but the songs that made him feel. Because behind every stage light, every roaring crowd, and every note of perfection, there was still that same little boy, trying to understand why the thing that made people love him was also the thing that wouldn't let him rest. And though he didn't know it yet, this tension, this heartbreak, this endless chase would one day define the man he became. The boy who barely reached the mic had conquered the world. But he was beginning to wonder if the cost of reaching it was losing himself. Years passed. The world had changed, but one thing remained the same. The image of that little boy, singing his heart out, making people rise. Only now he wasn't little anymore, and the weight of what he carried had become too heavy for a child's shoulders. Michael was no longer singing to be heard. He was singing to survive. The schedule was relentless. Tours, recordings, interviews. Every moment was planned, every word rehearsed, every movement measured. But what no one saw was what happened after the curtain fell. Behind those perfect performances were sleepless nights, tears that never reached the public eye, and a growing silence that fame couldn't fill. He missed laughter, real laughter, not the rehearsed smiles on magazine covers. He missed the innocence that once lived in his voice before it was shaped, sharpened, and sold. Some nights, in the middle of his exhaustion, he'd remember that small stage in Gary, the old microphone that towered above him, the fear that turned into fire, the crowd that stood up in awe. That was pure. That was real. Now, surrounded by gold records and flashing lights, he felt farther from that moment than ever. People called him a genius, a prodigy, a miracle. But Michael didn't feel like any of those things. He felt like a boy who had traded his childhood for applause, and applause he was beginning to realize was a dangerous kind of love. It faded fast, demanded more, and never let you rest. At home, the pressures didn't stop. The family dynamic was shifting. Fame had made them rich, but not necessarily happy. What once united them was now the very thing pulling them apart. Michael began to crave solitude. He'd retreat to corners of studios, scribbling lyrics, trying to find meaning in words that could heal what he couldn't say aloud. His voice, once a gift, had become a burden. Because it wasn't just sound anymore. It was expectation. He'd sing one perfect note, and the world would want 10 more. He'd dance one flawless move, and the world would expect magic every night. And he gave it, every time, because he didn't know how not to. That was the cruel irony. The very drive that made him great was also what kept him from peace. He'd stare at the crowds, thousands screaming his name, and feel something heartbreaking, loneliness in the middle of love. He couldn't explain it, but it was always there. The echo between the applause and the silence, and in that silence, he'd hear the faintest sound, the memory of his 5-year-old self, singing because he loved it. Not because the world demanded it. That voice, innocent, hopeful, free, whispered to him like a ghost. "Remember why you started." Those words haunted him. Because the truth was, he didn't remember anymore. He only remembered how it felt, the fire, the joy, the magic. But the feeling was fading, replaced by exhaustion, pressure, and a deep ache for something simpler. One night, sitting alone after a sold-out show, he looked at himself in the mirror. The reflection was flawless, the world's biggest star. But behind the perfection, he saw the cracks. He whispered to his reflection, "Is this what you wanted?" There was no answer, only silence. And for the first time, Michael felt the full weight of his journey, from a boy who could barely reach the mic to a man who could no longer escape it. He realized the tragic truth. The world had risen for him, but he had been falling ever since. Years later, when people spoke about Michael Jackson, they spoke in superlatives: the king of pop, the greatest entertainer of all time, the child prodigy who changed music forever. But behind those titles was a story few truly understood, a story that began with a microphone too tall for a 5-year-old boy. That boy, nervous, trembling, standing under the spotlight for the first time, didn't know he was stepping into history. He just wanted to sing, and that's the tragedy and the triumph of Michael Jackson's story. What began as innocent love for music became a lifelong pursuit of perfection, and a lifetime of sacrifice. Yet, through all the pain, the loneliness, the endless rehearsals, he gave the world something timeless: truth. Because when Michael sang, he didn't just perform, he felt. Every lyric carried the echo of his childhood, the longing, the beauty, the hope. that refused to die. When the world hears his voice, even now, decades later, it's not just a song we hear. It's the voice of a boy who never stopped reaching, for the mic, for love, for peace. And maybe that's why his story still moves us. Because somewhere deep inside, we all recognize that same yearning, to be seen, to be heard, to be loved without condition. The image of that 5-year-old remains eternal, small, fragile, but unstoppable. He sang because something inside him had to. That spark never left him, no matter how dark the world became. And in the end, despite all the noise, all the pain, all the misunderstanding, his voice endured. Michael Jackson's life wasn't just a story of fame. It was a story of transformation, a story of a child who carried the sound of innocence into a world that tried to take it away, and somehow, against all odds, made it echo forever. When we listen to his early recordings, the way his young voice cracked with emotion, the way he reached notes no one thought possible, we can still hear that night in Gary, the trembling start, the powerful finish, the audience rising to their feet, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. That moment was more than music. It was revelation, because the truth is, greatness doesn't begin in perfection. It begins in fear, in the courage to face the unknown, in the trembling voice that dares to sing anyway. Michael did that. At 5 years old, he faced the world before he even knew what the world was, and he won. But the victory was bittersweet, because while the world gained an icon, a piece of Michael's innocence was left behind on that stage forever. And yet, perhaps that was the price of timelessness, to give up something of yourself so others could feel something eternal. Today, when his music plays, it doesn't matter how much time has passed. You can close your eyes and for a moment, you're there again, in that small hall in Gary, watching a boy barely tall enough to reach the microphone change the air in the room. You can almost feel the silence before he sings, the disbelief that follows, the thunder of applause that lifts the ceiling. And even now, after all these years, you can still hear it, the echo of a child who gave his heart to the world and never truly got it back. That echo lives on, not just in the music, not just in the legend, but in every person who's ever stood before something terrifying and dared to begin. Because Michael's story isn't just about fame. It's about courage. It's about creation. It's about what happens when a 5-year-old finds his voice and uses it to wake the world. He couldn't reach the mic that night, but he reached us, and the world has been standing ever since.